This is One-on-One. I'm Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean in the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. I'm joined here today with my colleague Chris Shaffer, who is Dean of Libraries, and we're here to discuss Chris's book, Moon Over Sosova. Moon Over Sosova. So I want to talk to you about your experience in first Czechoslovakia because you were there in 1991,
Yes.
and then later Slovakia because you returned in 1993. And you were a student at Auburn University during that first trip to Czechoslovakia, and it was a study abroad program. And then the second time you came back as a teacher. Tell us a little bit about how things had changed in just those 2 years.
Well, first off, I think it's a testament to how profound a study abroad experience can be. And I had 8 hours left to graduate from Auburn in the summer, and I think it cost something bizarre like $300 more to either stay in super hot Auburn in the summer or to go abroad. And on a weekend trip, I went to Prague and just loved it. I mean, it was just such a beautiful city, and there was just a great feeling about the city. Westerners hadn't discovered it all that much yet in general. There were signs everywhere, posters that said Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle, as you know, he was about to become president. And so I made the decision to go back at the end of my studies and stay for longer. And then by 1993, well, while I was there in 91, I found the opportunity to go teach. And so I was trying to get back to Prague, if we're all honest, about the whole thing. And in the interim, of course, the revolution was called the Velvet Divorce because there was very little bloodshed. And then in 93, there was the Velvet Divorce. And so I ended up going to Slovakia, the other half of the former Czechoslovakia. But the real change didn't come between 91 and 93. There's by the time I went back in like 94, 95, and 96, you could really see capitalism starting to take hold. But the first 2 years, it didn't change all that much. The one thing in 91 and 93 that was true is we were a novelty as Americans. And I mean, they were just generous and nice and fascinated because we were Martians on their planet as far as they were concerned.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about being a novelty over there. In what ways did people treat you differently, or in what ways did you stand out as somebody that was probably perceived as a tourist and not part of the economy?
Well, in Slovakia, what I was there to do was to teach conversational English, so basically third-year students or above, and also to sort of just be a good example of what Americans are like, and what America was like, I think. And so teach English, foster a love of democracy, I think. And what was really fun about that is, you can sort of do conversational English everywhere.
Well,
and
you have a facility with German.
I have a very slow facility with German. The first time I was ever in Germany, I was trying to ask somebody where a bar was, and they couldn't understand me. And I'm like, this is fundamental to your culture, and I can't even say this.
Beer, even beer, they probably would have gotten that.
I started doing the hand gesture, and he's like, ja, das ist klar.
Well, so now it's been some 30 years since your experience
Yes.
there. And what made you decide to write about this experience all these decades later?
I had thought about it probably almost every other day for something like 28 years.
Wow.
And it was such a positive experience. They were so good to me. I mean, I was always being invited into homes and taken out to places, and I would try to pay for things, and no, you're the guest. And of course, they could almost kill you with kindness, particularly in terms of the alcohol.
I noticed how hospitable they were, and all the stories you would share about that. And I also noticed how often you discussed food and drink, and how important that was to your experience and your memories of the place. But I'll let you continue. Sorry.
Well, I mean, it's funny. It was mostly Northerners who were there, not a whole lot of Southerners, and for whatever reason. And apparently, the Slovak diet did not necessarily sit well with them, because they kept looking for a salad, and they really were not likely to find what an American would call a salad. And meanwhile, I was from Alabama. I've always been a meat and potatoes guy, and they just kept handing me deep fried meat and potatoes, and I was like, "This is heaven,"
Well, I liked the story, but even you have so many funny anecdotes in here, and I love the story about going to KFC and then the Dunkin' Donuts, where you were used to buying donuts by the dozen, but they didn't sell them that way. They sold them individually, and so you just had to keep sitting down and going back up and ordering another donut, and eyebrows were raised at this.
Oh yeah, and that was in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and it was April, and we had 4 months of this super harsh Slovak winter, and it was spring in Slovenia. It's a good bit to the south, former Yugoslavia, and so we got there, and I hadn't seen fast food in forever, and it's not one of my favorite things, but it was just a little taste of home. And but yeah, went to KFC, Dairy Queen, and what was the other one? There was
oh gosh!
The Dunkin' Donuts.
The Dunkin' Donuts.
And they thought we were complete freaks, and maybe we were, but we just, they'd give us this one donut, and we'd pay whatever we paid, and then we went downstairs 3 or 4 times, and finally we still wanted more, but we were getting a little embarrassed.
Well, it's interesting because we associate fast food with sort of Western capitalism, and there were a lot of experiences that you portrayed in this book which show sort of the emergence of a capitalist economy in what was previously part of the Soviet bloc. And I'm curious what you learned about that experience. I mean, you share little stories about small things like, oh, there's a bureaucracy here, or here's a soldier that was pointing his gun at us. But did you notice in the aggregate something transformative taking place while you were there?
I think that they really liked the concept of democracy. That was a big deal, I mean, and in Slovakia it was not as harsh in terms of totalitarianism as, say, Romania, which was a real bad one. Everybody was spying on each other. Inside the USSR, former USSR, it was a much more stringent form, but the openness that was starting to develop, that was very much liked. The transition to capitalism was very hard on people. I mean, it really, it was just a jerk to the whole system. And I don't know if it could have been otherwise. The Czechs under Havel were a tad more aggressive than the Slovaks. But they'd had state price controls for years, and there were still state price controls when I went there. So it was funny. You could have a very good standard of living by whatever you needed, often wanted, on a Slovak salary, which, by the way, I was making $100 a month, and that was about normal. It was about average. You were paid in cash. They had no concept of a credit economy. So every 2 weeks, I would go and they would count out 1,500 Slovak crowns. They switched to a new currency while I was there, because the country was only 14 days old when I got there.
Wow.
And so they were still using Czechoslovak crowns, and so then they used Slovak crowns. And you had to get to the bank by a certain drop dead date, or you just had some cute, cool souvenirs.
Well, you've mentioned Václav Havel a few times now, and Havel was an interesting figure. He was a poet, he was a playwright, not the typical politician, at least by today's measure. Why do you think we lack public figures like this now, politicians who are, let's say, literate or cultured?
Well, you can go too far. You can be too literate sometimes, I
Sure.
think. I mean, I think of Landsbergis in Lithuania, And he was almost too much so. Havel was this perfect mixture, and he had always been tied up in politics. It is so dysfunctional right now in our government. And anything someone doesn't like, in terms of us, the people, well, that must be a lie, and the media is spreading a lie. And I always love it with local stations, and WTVY will report, the president went from A to B today. And WTVY is sold out to the liberals or the conservatives. I'm like, the man took a trip. That's all they told you. and so I think the people are dysfunctional. I think the government is dysfunctional and sometimes encourages the people's stupidity. And I think we, I had a good friend recently talk about a conversation he had with someone. He's conservative, the other person was liberal, and the guy said something negative, and he said, you realize we're all trying to get to the same place. We just have somewhat different ideas. Doesn't mean the other one's the devil. And I think everybody was able to rally around Havel, and we need to find someone that more than 45% of the country can rally around, which is, I think, what we've had for the last definitely the last 6 years, maybe longer than that.
Well, could you talk about your trip to Krakow and Auschwitz, your experience traveling there?
The Holocaust has always been a lifelong interest of mine, and I serve with Dr. Dan Puckett on the Alabama Holocaust Commission today. But Krakow was a difficult place to get to. Things kept going wrong, so I think it was the third or fourth shot that we finally got there, and beautiful, beautiful city. And the last full day, we made the decision to go to Auschwitz, and I think it was just one of the most profound experiences of my life. I was a history major. I knew what to expect. I had seen film. But I guess when I say I knew what to expect, I knew what happened. I didn't necessarily know how it had been preserved. And so you get there, and of course you see the barracks and the things like that, and the Arbeit macht frei sign. But you also, they had these glassed-in rooms that were about the size of a school classroom, and one of them was nothing but human hair. And that's sort of the image I've always taken with me, that, and then they had another room, similar setup, with personal artifacts, shoes, shaving equipment, stuff like that. And I mean, it was a factory of death. I mean, that's all it was. That was their specialty.
Yeah, it's profoundly disturbing. Well, like you, Chris, I spent a lot of time traveling when I was young, when I was 18, traveling through Europe, and then studying abroad in college. Moving to Japan after graduating from college, then studying abroad in law school a couple of times in a couple of places. And so I know how impactful travel can be to someone in those early years, let's say formative years, late teenage or to early 20s. What would you say to college students who are considering maybe going on a study abroad trip, or who might like to pursue a career abroad, or at least some time abroad after graduating from college?
I think anytime you can do it, you ought to. And I think it changes your perspective. When I was in high school, middle school, we watched the news every night. My family was big on news. I was reading 2 newspapers a day when I was in 9th grade. And everything I read about Eastern Europe and the Soviets was, they were harsh, they were cold. I'd never seen a picture of an attractive woman from that part of the world. And of course I got there, and beautiful people, friendly people, warm people. And so that will totally change your perspective when you suddenly realize people are often just very good. Maybe they're generally very good. Maybe that's too optimistic. Governments quite often get in the way of all of us being friends. And so it can very much change your perspective. And I tried to use that. I was a teacher for 8 years, and I always tried to bring that attitude into my classes. Another thing, every job I ever got was because of Slovakia. But it's just something that makes you stand out. And quite often, I always thought it was funny. People would say that I had all this courage because you know I've had all this international experience, and it's not scary, you know, not at all.
Well, it's empowering.
Yeah.
It's empowering, and it teaches you how to navigate different cultures and to learn your way around other places. And it really can be a transformative experience. And I think young people ought to, as you say, pursue those types of opportunities if they arise. You and your wife, you mentioned, have different accounts for about when this book was written or how this book was written. Tell us about just the process of writing the book. You know, sitting down, where you did it. Were you at home? Were you at the office here at Troy?
Here's the true story. We'll do that.
Your fingers are crossed.
The lie is faster. The story my wife came up with, and it is good, was everybody else was sitting around getting fat during COVID, which I also kind of did, and but what I did, the librarian with great pluck, during COVID, I had the focus to sit down and write this book. Nay. What happened in the early fall semester of 2019, my secretary had surgery, and she had to be out for almost 2 months, I guess. And so I was in the office alone, and I started coming in at 7 o'clock every morning, which really freaked everybody out because punctuality is not my thing, and earliness definitely is not. And my goal was to write 5,000 words a week.
Oh, wow.
And so I would write 2 hours a day, 7 to 9, and then work through lunch. And at the end of about 10 weeks, I had a book.
Wow.
But I did an outline that was entirely based on the just different things, because the book is really, as we're talking about, just a lot of vignettes. And I had my journals to go by. I had the photo albums from the '93 trip. And then in the middle of the whole process, the oddest thing happened. My best friend died a few years ago. And his brother called me and said, "Would you like to have lunch?" And I said, "Sure." And he brought with him all of these letters we had exchanged.
Wow.
When I was over there. And so the friend actually helped me write the book, from Beyond the Grave or whatever. And that gave it, that just felt good.
Were there stories that did not make it in?
I'm
that
sure
you can tell.
I'm sure they are, but when that happened, it was only because I just couldn't quite recreate the event. It wasn't because the story wasn't good. I just couldn't fill in enough holes to make it a valid entry. The only punches pulled in the book is it's a happy book. It's a nice book.
Yeah, and you're funny, by the way. You have a lot of
be.
funny accounts. Even at the beginning when you're talking about your grandmother being worried about walking on the cobblestone streets.
I tell you, that was a Hail Mary if ever there was one. But she was so supportive and like, "Oh yeah, sure, you're going to go to Czechoslovakia. That's great." And then it got time for launch, and she just freaked out. And she was like, "They're communists." I'm like, "They're not communists. They're over that one." And I've forgotten what all the other ones were. And finally she said, "There's cobblestone streets over there. Do you realize what that can do to your feet?" And I said, "I think you're going to have to let it go." But and then she, because I'm such a tightwad, she even tried to bribe me and said she would, pay the cost of the ticket to pay that back and give me $1,000 on top. And I said no.
Well, you ended up lucking out on a free Eurail pass at one point too.
God love Warren Wolfenden of Ontario, Canada. But he had been in, I've never met him, by the way, but if you're out there, thank you. The story I got, he had been over there on a 90-day Eurail Flexi Pass, which is, the granddaddy of Flexi Passes. It costs a fortune. You can travel for forever on 90 days. And like on day 89, he evidently lost his pass. And he was in Italy, and he went to the Eurail Bureau or whatever and was trying to explain what had happened. They just gave him a brand new 90-day pass. Well, now he can travel nonstop, but he's penniless. I mean, been over there for about a half year. And so he sold it to someone who I then met. And she'd used it for a few weeks and then gave it to me. And once they stamp that pass, once they initiate it, they don't ask for an ID again, or at least they didn't used to. This is 30-year-old information, so be careful. But disclaimer. But you just hold it up, and so I traveled for effectively free. I gave her 25 marks for it, and traveled around for 2 weeks. That was in '91, and had a birthday on San Marco Piazza.
That's where you had the Jack and Coke.
Had a Jack and Coke. I was sophisticated. I thought that was the fanciest drink you could have back then.
Well, so many funny things happen just through either pronunciations or things that get lost in translation. I'm thinking about the jam, Jim, the confusion.
The people who lived above me were Yugoslavian. The husband was Serb, and Lucy, he was Joseph. Lucy was Croatian. So you had a little bit of ethnic tension since the war was raging. But they had immigrated to Canada. He made a fortune in construction, and then decided he wanted to come back home to Yugoslavia, and boom, the revolution starts. And they were drafting everybody, so he wanted out. His mistake was he transferred all his money from Canada to Yugoslav banks, and they froze his accounts. You can only get small amounts out at a time. And so that's how he wanted to stay close to his money. Moves to Slovakia, and he's living in our apartment building. And he always had some money-making scheme. And I don't know why he thought a couple of 22-year-old Americans had money to invest in these businesses. But we're up there one night, and he says, "Chris, I have a great idea for a business. In Czech Republic, they have just fantastic gyms. They have the best gym. What was it? Was it no jam? Jam. Jam was wrong. They have fantastic jams." And it goes on, and he was saying gems. He was talking about,
but you were hearing gems.
Yeah, and that's what he was saying, and finally I was just like, no, we're not going to start.
We've got a lot of jelly and jam in America.
Yeah, we got them all over the place.
Why do you think it's going to sell over there?
And it was garnets, I think, is what he was talking about. They mine a lot of garnets in Czechoslovakia, but.
Well, people like that. Did you lose touch with most of them over the years? I mean, this was a period of pre-internet and pre-cell phones.
Well, that was the thing. Communication is really fascinating to think back on. It was a true immersion experience. I mean, if I wanted to call home, I was my grandmother or mother was out about $45 for a 20-minute call.
I loved that she wrote you almost weekly notes. By the way, your grandmother.
Yeah,
I thought that was very special, and you've saved.
I've got everything.
Yeah,
that's
fantastic.
And since my mother's still alive, my mother did too.
Well, we'll make sure she gets credit as well, since we're on record here.
But anyway, I was able to stay in some contact, and I am still in contact with some people, but most people over time, it did just sort of fade. For a long time, I was using a fax machine. When I got back, I bought a fax machine and would communicate that way. But you do sort of lose touch, and actually I'm not sure you don't lose touch even with all the social media and other things that we've got, because So supposedly, with all this technology, we were all going to be friends forever and ever. But let's face it, if you haven't physically seen someone in 10 years, things have changed.
That's right. And people change and circumstances change. Well, I want to give Ed Noriega a shout out because he did the cover design for the book.
Isn't that great?
It's great. Yeah, he did a great job.
The castle, that is the best picture I took over there, I guess. It's
so this is actually, is this a reproduction of a photo you took?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so anyway, it's in Trenton. What we didn't talk about, and didn't think to point out, Sosova is a suburb of the place where I was working. The town was Banska Bystrica. And what I discovered, this is a beautiful town, it's this medieval mining city, and so it was rich. They mined copper there. And what I discovered was I didn't have a single good picture that I took of Banska Bystrica because I was living there. And so I wasn't walking around with the camera when I was there, and we didn't have these phones where we were just taking pictures of anything and everything. So then I wanted one of my pictures on the cover, and so we just began this journey through the photo album, and I'd say, how about this one? And Ed would be like, I know you're proud of it, but it's a pretty lousy picture.
That sounds like Ed. I can see Ed saying that.
There's this thing called perspective, and you're not using it. And then the babushka, grandma, that was his concept, because there are all of these grandmotherly types who were in various sort of menial yet authoritarian roles over there. For instance, if you went to the movie theater, they had an old woman walking both sides, and they would make sure you were in your assigned seat, although there were never more than 7 or 8 people in this entire theater, but that was a big deal. If you were crazy enough to put your foot up on a seat, you would hear about that. So they were kind of enforcers. They also, there were pay restrooms over there if you were in a public restroom. So they were the ones who would give you that one sheet of paper, for the 1 crown or whatever it is. And I'm American. I need a lot more than one sheet of paper. And so I just started carrying toilet paper in my book bag. But anyway, this babushka, the babushka in question, comes to you courtesy of Shutterstock. And my publisher had an account and said, I got all the old women you want right here. Just pick one. And we liked her.
That's great. Well, have you ever gone on Google Street View to find where you lived and to walk around the streets via Google Street View? And you have done that.
I have, and actually I went back in 2007.
Okay.
Was my last time. I did trips in 94 and 95, and then I went back and taught again for a half year in 96. Went to Prague in about 98 for New Year's. And then 2007, after a fellowship in Germany, I backpacked for 2 weeks. I also discovered I was old. And it only took about 3 months for the back and the feet to recover. And I stayed in Banska Bystrica for about 4 days. I was able to catch up with a few people, and it was just great.
Well, the name of the book is Moon Over Sosova. This is Chris Shaffer, Dean of the Libraries at Troy University, and this has been a great show. Chris, thanks for telling us about your book.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.